Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome back to this week's episode, and this is also a solo episode. If you listened in last week, this is the follow-up episode to our series on how to rethink our performance management or performance appraisal process. So last week we looked at how you might consider where you are currently within your organisation. And this week we're going to talk about the evidence that you might gather from outside of your organisation. So we've talked before, we know that it's advisable for us as HR or people professionals to be as evidence-based as possible. There isn't always objective evidence available to us, although that is what I'm going to look at in this episode and share that with you. But last week was very much about how you can gather evidence and information from within your organisation to make sure that the decisions and changes you're thinking of making are well thought through. They're not knee-jerk. So you can go back and listen to last week's. There's downloads that support all of these 3 episodes. So I'm doing a similar follow-up episode next week, which is all about the practicalities. And this episode, I'm going to share with you the information that we got from a research review. We engaged with a Professor Nuno de Camara a few years ago, who trawled through the last 50 or 60 years worth of evidence about which aspects of people and performance management were actually linked to positive outcomes. So it's difficult because, of course, lots of this would be incidental. There's not loads of research that's put into things like this because there's no one necessarily who invests in it. But he was able to trawl through all the evidence that was available in terms of correlations where these sort of people performance management practice or HRM practices were linked to increased productivity or employee engagement, so outcomes that our organisations would consider worthwhile generating. If you want to download the whole research review, there'll be a link in the show notes for you there, or you can go to the Actus website and you can download it there too. So one of the first points to be aware of, and I alluded to this, the same researchers, Beckham and Insler, they pointed out that their high-performing organisations use their performance management process to keep the following promise to their employees. Basically, they're saying that a performance management process is stating, if you meet or exceed the expectations of your job and contribute to our mission, then we will meet or exceed your career and reward expectations. So that might seem like common sense, but one of the things that we often find is missing is a true sense of balance or two-way. And I talked about balancing people and performance in last week's episode. And it is important to make sure that our performance management process is in balance. It's genuinely designed to benefit both the organisation and the individual. And when you look into that as to how you might generate that balance, make sure it's two-way, there were 8 key features that came out of the research review that make the most effective performance management processes. And I'll go through each of those within this podcast episode. So I'll run through them quickly now, and then I'll group them together to discuss them more practically. And next week, we'll look at how you can actually include them within your design, the design of any appraisal process that you decide to put in place. So the first one is goal setting, and I'll just run through them now. We'll discuss them in a moment. So goal setting. The second one is ongoing feedback in line with performance. Then strategic alignment of goals. The fourth one is trained managers. Fifth one is having coaching and development. 6 is consistency and transparency. 7 is having a climate of trust and support, and 8 is recognition and reward of performance. So logically, we need to build all these aspects into any performance management process that we decide to design. And as I say, I'll share ways in which you can do this practically. And if we want to do this, we need to really highlight these, and I'll group them together to make it simpler for us to talk about this cohesively. Clearly, if you want to go and look at the individual research, you can go to the research review itself and download it. So if we start by grouping goal setting, feedback in line with performance, and strategic alignment of goals, what are these really saying? And actually, goal setting is the number one most common, it's the best researched, I think, piece of evidence that you see in terms of direct correlation with performance, or it recurrently comes up time and time again that if you don't have quality goal setting, you're not likely to have high performance. So it's really quite a robust finding in behavioural science terms that we need to make sure that goal setting is going on in our organisation if we want to drive high performance. And, the good old SMART acronym, many of us think, oh yes, I know what SMART is, but sometimes it's underestimated as to why it actually is a pretty good acronym as they go. So if I was to say that your goals should be S specific, measurable, achievable, then the second R as the first R, is relevant. And what we mean by that is strategically relevant. And then, of course, you've got time bound. So within that SMART acronym, that is actually implying that it's important that not only are my individual goals specific, measurable, achievable, and time bound, but they also need to be relevant, i.e. aligned to the strategic direction of the business. That benefits the business, but it also benefits me because it means that I can see and I'm focused and motivated to achieve them. And what I'm planning to do on a day-to-day basis in terms of my performance objectives is seen as meaningful. So it ties me in. We talk about the golden thread. So that's quite an interesting one, really, because it's also, there are other aspects of the goal setting that they talk about. If there's evidence that if you have a goal and you consider it to be stretching, it's actually more motivational than something that you consider to be easy, which is interesting. And not only that, this whole concept of A for agreed. So some people say achievable is the A in SMART. I would also say think about agreed, because again, if you think about when you say your own goal out loud, whether it was an exercise goal, you commit to something external, you have a conversation, then you're bought into it. So this whole SMART acronym, if you add in not just the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time bound, but you make it strategically relevant, you make them stretching objectives and also agreed, all of those actually are playing into the motivation and the power of what a really effective goal looks like. It's something that we're motivated by. We know specifically what to do. We know when we need to do it by. We think it's achievable, but it's worthwhile achieving because it's stretching, it's challenging enough, but not impossible. And we've said out loud, we've committed to it, we've agreed to it. Then you can see why actually good quality goal setting is quite a powerful tool. But you don't want it just on its own, because if we don't also have feedback with that, and ideally in the case of performance management processes, that would be feedback between an individual and the line manager, but it could be ways in which I can reflect on my own performance. It could be updating my own performance and taking responsibility for that. Then we need to make sure that we've got that sense of progress. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why a once yearly approach doesn't really work, because goals need tweaking. I sometimes think of a goal or an objective as a bit like a navigation system. If you're on a boat, you could set your direction in a certain way, but you have to keep tweaking to stay on track, because the waves and the wind and things will take you off course, which is just like the busy life that we have out here. There's always distractions, aren't there, that take us off course. So we need these goals to stay on track, but we also need to have regular feedback against them to check that, just those sort of ways of staying engaged and seeing if we are on track, and actually is that direction or destination still relevant. So goal setting with regular timely feedback is incredibly powerful. It sounds obvious. What we need to do, therefore, is think about, in any process that we set up, then actually the goal setting should be the key point of it. And it's surprising when you think about this, because probably everything I've said up to now you thought, yeah, I know that, it's common sense, it's obvious, SMART's been around forever. However, many of you, I'm quite sure, if you looked at your organisation, you'd know that the pinnacle of the performance management process would be the appraisal conversation. It's like the main thing. I still work with organisations that come and say, yeah, we're not really bothered about anything else, it's just all about the appraisal. But the reality is, what's the point of an appraisal if you haven't agreed objectives or goals in the first place? What are we actually appraising? In terms of those 8 evidence-based deliverables that the research review threw out, was appraisal one of them? No, it wasn't. So arguably, you could get rid of appraisal altogether, although in reality, that's probably less realistic than some may feel. But I'm going to say get rid of appraisal altogether, but only if you are going to replace it with goal setting and feedback, goal setting and feedback, goal setting and feedback. The reason I would suggest that it isn't an ideal to get rid of it, that appraisal still has a place, is because it works really well as a culmination of a series of goals and feedback. And if you want to have the ability to deliver positive consequences to those who are high performers, it's quite difficult to do that if you don't have some sort of timetable of culmination. But the point that I would like to take away from this is that if you only have appraisal without goal setting, what are you appraising? So for me, appraisal is just an incidental. If we've got effective goal setting, regular feedback going on, and those goals are strategically aligned, which those first 3 evidence-based points, then that would be the place I would start if I was designing an evidence-based performance management process. And when you're doing this, one of the challenges I sometimes hear is that organisations don't always have their overall strategic goals ready at the start of the year. Perhaps, unfortunately, quite often, goals are known only to those at the very top. And it can be the case that that becomes a blocker in terms of kicking off a process because the strategic goals haven't been cascaded. Maybe taking this sort of evidence to the people at the top and explaining how important it is, even if you don't have the precise numbers of the goals, but having the general strategic direction of what's important from the top down is really, really helpful if you want to drive a real focus in terms of performance and making sure that people are aligned. And of course, this then flips through into the second couple of points, which was about management skills, managers having the right training, and also coaching and development, which there's 2 aspects to for me in relation to this. So first of all, in terms of management skills, well, do your managers have the skills, knowledge, motivation to carry out continuous performance management? Has it ever been role modelled for them? Do they think it is of benefit? Are they recognised if they do a good job? I mean, the evidence clearly demonstrates that people perform better if they have this high quality feedback, which, it's not just, high quality feedback is also specific. It's actually a skill to give high quality feedback. Do your managers generally know how to do that? And not only the feedback, do they get coaching to help people to go to the next level? So if I'm developing a skill in a certain area, if I was given specific feedback about what I was doing really well and where I had gaps and was coached as to how I could close that gap, then that is a skill on behalf of the manager that I'm working with. And that is one of the most effective ways of helping me to grow and to perform even higher. Not all managers have either the skill to do that or the time or patience. And are we actually setting that expectation in terms of our organisation to ensure that managers who go into people management roles have been trained about the value of these sort of activities? Are they recognised for those? Are the expectations clearly set that across the organisation we have to behave consistently, which of course is point 5 in this list, or 6 in this list actually, consistency and transparency. All of these link together. You can see it feels very much like common sense, but remember, this has actually come out of research reviews as the things that come through time and time again if you want to make sure that people are motivated to deliver their best. So in terms of our coaching and development and training our managers, we also have to be clear in terms of the expectations of a people manager. And this links back to, if you're going to have a process, although we've said earlier, in theory, the appraisal is not the most important thing in the world, what you do need to do is make sure that there is some clear expectation about the frequency of conversations between manager and employee, ideally a timetable. If you are to be able to react to the outputs of any performance management process, then you need to know when those outputs will be available. So if you want to do a training needs analysis, for example, then ideally you need people to have completed those within a certain time frame so that you can pull reporting on those. If you've got a system, obviously it's much easier, but if it's manual, then that's quite a time-consuming thing to be able to extract those development needs that people are requesting. So it all needs to line up and be seen as part of this overall strategic process. It's not a tactical process, and we need to understand why it's important. And part and parcel of understanding why it's important is people realising that these activities are directly related to performance, to success of the organisation, and I'll come on to success of the individual, and our managers need to value this process, and those managers who do it well need to be valued. They need to be recognised for doing it. So coaching and development needs to sit in the process, whether we're talking about coaching and development from the point of view of the manager developing the individual to perform, or for people to see it as an output. So we talked last week about one of the complaints about the appraisal process people have is that nothing comes of it. Sometimes they feel that there was no purpose to it. Well, sometimes even if you can't link pay, loads of businesses are unable to link pay to performance at the moment, or even if they can, it may not be valued, because in times of high inflation, if you're as we have in the UK, then people think it's an expectation, it's a requirement as opposed to a reward. However, you can't always link reward as in monetary reward to things, but people getting the opportunity to get some specific development, that's perceived as of value. So there are other ways. So coaching and development in terms of a reward, an output or a consequence for someone who is performing effectively is legitimate as well. And that is where that particular point 6, consistency and transparency, that links in two ways in terms of people getting the opportunity to access development in a consistent way. Because you have a consistent process, you're looking at training at a certain point in the year, everyone is following that consistent process. It's not just Joe Bloggs' favourite person who gets the training and development. Actually, we all go through a process. At a certain point in the year, we will look at who is going to get access to development, who's going to get access to reward, if that's aligned, who gets the opportunity to go forwards for career progression. If you do things like pay review, the transparency point means that you have got a process that is demonstrably fair, i.e. a calibration process or something like that, if you're actually going to align rating with reward. So again, these flow into each other. This concept of coaching and development, is that applied consistently across the organisation? Are there transparent opportunities for people to access coaching and development? And any kind of reward or outcome that's related to your process, is that applied consistently and transparently? And of course, you can't really be consistent and transparent unless you have a defined process. So again, this closes the loop a bit, linking back to what we were talking about last week, is those people who actually would just like to get rid of any kind of requirements or definition at all. It isn't really realistic, because as soon as you do that, you'll get an ad hoc approach in your organisation. There'll be a lack of consistency, lack of transparency, and ultimately it's likely to go backwards in terms of performance as opposed to forwards. And again, point number 7 is a climate of trust and support. They almost feel like these points, they're all like a massive Venn diagram of 8 points here, isn't it? Because they link in as well. For us to be trusted as individuals, as managers, HR professionals, as an organisation, people need to trust that everyone is treated fairly. And again, consistency is a key part of that. If we need support and help, we need to get access to it. So do we get the development that we need to give of our best? And then finally, recognition and reward of performance. Even though, as I mentioned before, we may not always be able to offer financial reward, are we able to recognise, or are we able to offer reward in a different way? Do our managers know what people value? And this links back into the ongoing conversations, because one person maybe considers that training is a reward. Another one might think that time off is a reward. Another one is access to development, or another one might be pay. So people are motivated by different things, but the important thing is that we are recognising them for their performance, and we are seen to reward them in a way that's appropriate to them fairly. And that's really, really important. So I guess in summary, you can read through the whole report for yourself. It's got some really nice tables in there, and you can get the facts and you can get the actual references and who'd carried out the research. The really main thing is, it's not rocket science. The last 60 years of behavioural science research make it clear that any process that we design must include goal or objective setting. It needs some sort of regularity, so therefore one-to-ones or check-ins would make sense to have those defined in a consistent fashion to provide feedback and coaching for people. It needs to incorporate development and to be applied consistently across your organisation. As I said, I guess you could chuck out appraisal, but that would probably be counterproductive, because if you don't have something that's a culmination or a series of things where you have little small opportunities to take stock and gather key information, ideally if you've got a system you can pull that information out real time, but how can we respond and develop people and provide recognition, career opportunities in line with their performance, or let them feel like they're empowered to access it if you don't have a way of seeing that. So making sure that you've got that visibility if you possibly can. So the main takeaway for me there is that the appraisal is merely a culmination or touch point in our process. It shouldn't be the end in itself. But if we have visibility of these outputs, that is really helpful, because that will help us to act on it effectively. So that's the key summary, I guess, of what the evidence says. Let's just remind ourselves of those 8, interlinked points, the 8 key features that emerge from the research into what makes performance management really, truly effective in terms of productivity and engagement. Goal setting, ongoing feedback in line with performance, aligning our goals strategically. It's about having trained managers who provide coaching and development, but also are trained and have coaching and development themselves. And in addition to that, it's giving people access to coaching and development. That can be a motivator in itself. It's about whatever we do being really consistent, so not ad hoc. It needs to happen consistently across the organisation. We need to be transparent about how we reward and how we apply it. There should be a climate of trust and support for people to respect the feedback that they're getting, and there needs to be recognition and some form of reward, not necessarily monetary. Obviously, if it is monetary, that needs to be objectively distributed, but recognition, and there's some consequence that comes out of it. Now, interestingly for me, if you did listen last week, I can see quite a lot of links in those things which are positive, correlating with the things that people complained about that I alluded to last week, particularly where people moan about things being ad hoc, about there not being any consequence to things being tick box exercises. Those complaints wouldn't exist if you have a process that is really living and breathing those 8 key features that we've just outlined. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more inspiration. We're really in a position now where we can think about, we're going to rethink our own process. We know what our organisation is complaining about or unhappy about, and maybe what we need to change. We also know what the research says in terms of what good looks like. Next week, I'm going to talk about how you could implement continuous performance management so it becomes a sort of culture change. So we'll link into that and pull this all together, and the practicalities of how you can make this a reality in your organisation. As ever, check the show notes, because there will be links to useful downloads for you, the research review, etc., so you can put this into action and use it practically. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.